Welcome, everybody. Welcome as you file into the waiting room here. Let's see. Just clicking through the list, it seems like people are here and connected, so we can go ahead and get this meeting started. Please remember to put your microphone on mute if it's not already. I am so excited to welcome you all to today's event, the 2020 annual meeting, chapter update of AFP Minnesota, as well as the public policy update and discussion produced by the Public Policy Committee. My name is Dan Sassenberg, and I'm the president of AFP Minnesota. I'd love to give a brief update on the state of the chapter, but before I do, I have the honor of introducing one of the most longtime supporters of AFP Minnesota, past president of the chapter, Bridget Hansen. Bridget is CEO of Hansen, Henley, Yoder, and Lamb, and our AFP Minnesota Gold Chapter sponsor, as well as the sponsor of today's education session. So I know you're there, Bridget. Thank you so much for your sponsorship of the session today. And I'd like to welcome you now to unmute your microphone and share a few words with us.
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes, coming through just fine.
Great. Well, it's our pleasure to be supportive of the AFP chapter. As you said, I'm CEO of Hansen, Henley, Yoder, and Lamb. We're a full-service consulting firm in fundraising, specializing in annual endowment and major gifts campaigns and capital campaigns and strategic fundraising program development. So for us, being able to support the fundraising profession is really an honor. It's a profession that we've been in for most of our team members, close to 40 years. And I want to say congratulations to you, Dan, for serving as president for the past 2 years of AFP. And also do a shout out to Michelle Edgerton, the incoming president, who we had the opportunity to meet working on the Northside Achievement Zone campaign. We're very pleased to sponsor this particular session, both because it's an annual meeting, but also because it's about public policy, an arena that can also help significantly advance our profession. So we're excited that our colleague Jeremy Wells is going to be here in his esteemed panel, talking about the headway that's being made on the public policy front and how we can come together in support of our institutions and our profession by becoming more active and knowledgeable in this arena. With that, I'll thank you again for the time and again say how honored we are to be the sponsor for AFP and the chapter sponsor, and send it back to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Bridget. It's great to have you with us here today. All right, moving on. Before I proceed with my brief presentation, I do just want to pause for a moment and say thank you to all of you who are members of AFP Minnesota for being members. I was looking over the roster today. I know most of us are members of the chapter. I noticed a lot of current and former board members are in attendance today, and so I wanted to pause and thank you for your leadership, both now and in the past. You have really done so much to enable the chapter to be what it is today. I want to pause and say thank you to the committee volunteers and folks who have been serving on committees in some cases for many, many years, folks who in some cases have just been sitting on a committee for a year or two. The committees are really the engine of the chapter, and I know your dedicated hard work means so much. And to you folks who have joined committees more recently, thank you so much for your willingness to bring your fresh perspective to the chapter. And for those of you who are new to AFP, who may not even be members, who are may be curious about getting more involved, please don't hesitate to reach out to me personally. And I encourage you to check out the volunteer opportunities section of the website. I always say that getting involved as a volunteer on a committee is absolutely the best way to make the most of your AFP Minnesota membership. So 2020, as it goes without saying, was no ordinary year. The pandemic brought significant disruption to our usual ways of doing business. Our ability to generate revenue as a chapter from event registrations and sponsorships was severely impacted by the pandemic, and revenue from members was down as well. So we originally had budgeted a break-even budget of about $150,000. We will now close the year with a deficit probably in the neighborhood of $15,000. This is not a financial crisis for the chapter. We can afford it, but obviously we need to be looking very closely at how we proceed in future years to both make up for the deficit this year and put ourselves in a strong position moving forward. As I mentioned, the membership base did decline. That is a decline that's being seen across membership organizations in all industries, and ours is no exception. The overall association membership declined 14% from January to October, from little under 32,000 members to 27,000 members. Here at AFP Minnesota, we really mirrored that pretty closely with a decline in membership of about 16% from January to October of this year. And our members do simply tell us that, due to tightened budgets from the pandemic, they simply haven't been able to afford to renew their memberships this year. So I want to be sure everyone knows the board takes the topic of member value very seriously, that we're not simply saying, well, when the pandemic is over, we anticipate, lost members will come back. We are really making the most of this moment to understand how to drive more value back to our members for their membership, and also working to make the chapter more inclusive and more equitable and more representative of the entire community of fundraisers here in Minnesota. But I do want to stop and acknowledge the extraordinary work that's been done by chapter volunteers, particularly since the pandemic really got going in March. I count at least 10 virtual networking events around crisis fundraising communication, virtual events, fundraising goals in the time of COVID, BIPOC networking socials, 7 education events since the pandemic started, on everything from partnering with your executive director to community-centric fundraising, as well as partnering we did with the Council of Nonprofits on ActCon, on Grant Writers Incubator sessions, and on more. And of course, our wonderful, successful National Philanthropy Day celebration. It was really an honor to watch the NPD committee plan and then plan again as the reality that we're all living in changed. And they had to constantly sort of figure out how to do that pivot from an in-person to a virtual event. At one point during some mid-year budgeting, we were thinking we may not do any better than to break even on NPD. But thankfully, we were able to bring in over $20,000 in scholarships for the virtual event. We transitioned to a pay-what-you-can registration model. We had well over 250 attendees, and we still managed to generate some nice revenue to support the other chapter activities. And that's not all of the planning for the future that we did. For potentially the first time ever, we worked very hard to finalize a values statement for AFP Minnesota. This has been in the works since October of 2019 and was just recently finalized. And so I'm so grateful for the incredible hard work that went into generating this values statement. We did a lot of surveying, we did in-person interviews, and we arrived at these 5 values that I would like to read to you today. The first is authenticity. We create environments that allow us to bring our authentic selves together to share, collaborate, and learn from each other. Second is trust. We listen to and respond to our communities. In doing so, we build a foundation of trust and respect, supported by transparency and ethical behavior. Racial equity. We understand racism is systemic. To eliminate it, we need to take systemic anti-racist action. We commit to diversifying representation in our field. We commit to building power and agency for BIPOC fundraisers to guide all aspects of AFP's work. Responsibility. We have a responsibility to the larger nonprofit community, and we own our power and ability to ensure a strong and vital field. And finally, collaboration. We provide a platform to bridge and grow relationships. We share our unique experiences and expertise, help people feel more included, and create opportunities for new and diverse voices to emerge. You can look for a copy of these values coming your way by email into the website soon, as well as a little more sort of explanatory information that goes with each value. And this is not the only major forward-looking planning that we have done this year. On top of all the work we've done to respond to the pandemic, we also finalized this year the 2021 to 2023 strategic plan. We finalized the plan in keeping with the overall association's pillars for their 2021 to 2023 strategic plan. Those pillars are to promote inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, provide relevant and high quality fundraising education, increase capacity and strengthen community, and champion ethical fundraising practices. The board will actually be finalizing the strategic plan next week, and then it will also be coming to you via email and via the website. So you can really, I encourage you to dig into that and see the ways in which we are working to create a more equitable and inclusive chapter and also deliver more value back to members. As I begin to wind up my presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge some folks. It is hard to believe that this is already the third year of our IDEA Fellowship. The AFP Minnesota IDEA Fellowship is a one-year cohort experience of tailored professional development sessions and an all-inclusive golden tickets to AFP Minnesota. The fellowship includes full membership in both AFP, including free access to all of AFP Minnesota's education and social events, NPD, and more. So I did just want to take a brief moment to recognize the 2021 fellows, and my deepest apologies, I didn't reach out ahead of time for a pronunciation guide, so I'm sorry if I don't say everyone's name quite correctly, but Abdullahi Farah, Selena Her, M. Marina Lopez, Jolyn Mulari, Adobe Okole, Don Sell, and Elizabeth Zarnati. Any kind of congratulations to them and to all 3 years of cohorts of the fellowship. And the part of the annual meeting is, of course, this is where we sort of officially recognize the incoming board of directors. I'm so grateful to pass the baton of president to my fabulous colleague, Michelle Edgerton. I'm very excited for the next 2 years of her presidency. I will move into the immediate past president position, and then we have a really stellar slate of some new and returning board members joining us on the executive committee as chairs of the different committees. We have 8 incoming board members this year, and then a little over 20 returning board members. And so very grateful for this hardworking, talented, thoughtful, and dedicated group. And especially to the newcomers who are joining us this year. I know some of you are on this call. A few of you I haven't met yet, but thank you so much for your support and engagement with the chapter. And then finally, I'm sure you've heard about the Be the Cause campaign with some solicitations in your mailbox and in your inbox. The foundation generates resources to fund AFP strategic initiatives that advance ethical and effective fundraising. We still have about $4,000 left to raise this year to hit our AFP Minnesota goal. And then when we hit that goal, we get a 25% regrant back from the foundation. And we really count on that regrant back to support some local activities. So if you haven't made your contribution to the Be the Cause Foundation yet this year, I really hope that you will do that in the next few days. Thank you so much. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me personally if you have any questions. Like I said, go on to the website to read about volunteer opportunities, and I will stop sharing my screen now and turn the meeting over to Jennifer Shull.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon and welcome AFP members to today's public policy update and discussion. My name is Jen Shull and I'm the incoming Public Policy Committee Vice President for 2021. 2021 is the third year for AFP Minnesota's chapter's Public Policy Committee. Our goal is to support our members in their efforts to advocate with government representatives on issues that impact their nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, and the fundraising profession. We have a new resource available for the members of our chapter on our website at afpminnesota.org/resources. Here you will find a variety of resources and tools, as well as updates from the Public Policy Committee. We invite all members to consider joining the Public Policy Committee. You do not need to have a background in public policy or in government relations to join. Our hope is to bring as many voices and experiences to the table as we can, and continue to develop our support for members in this really critical work. Our committee can also be a resource to help your organization grow in its Government Relations and Advocacy program. Please check out our webpage for more information or contact me directly for details. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for our education session today. Please welcome fellow AFP member and member of our Public Policy Committee, Jeremy Wells. Jeremy is a Senior Vice President in Philanthropic Services at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation and will be serving as our facilitator for our discussion today. We are also pleased to introduce another fellow AFP member and Public Policy Committee member, Jon Severson, as a panelist. Jon currently serves as the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Government Relations at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And next, I would like to introduce two very special guests as panelists. Both are nonprofit leaders and experts in grassroots advocacy here in Minnesota. Please welcome Rinal Ray, CEO of People Serving People, and Bharti Wahi, the Executive Director of Children's Defense Fund of Minnesota. And now I will turn over the mic to Jeremy to get us started as we explore how nonprofit organizations can be involved in public policy, the difference between advocacy and lobbying, and how the nonprofit sector can do a better job of lifting up our voices and amplifying the voices of those we serve through our public policy work. Off to Jeremy.
Great, thank you so much, Jen. Good to see many familiar faces I haven't seen in a little while. I miss seeing each of you in person due to COVID, but it's great to spend some time with you today. I won't take too much of the time because I want to get on to the three panelists we have, but I want to say a few words about public policy in general, just to set the stage, and then we'll move into panel discussion. For a couple of housekeeping items, if you have questions that arise as we go throughout the presentation, type them into the chat box. I will try and monitor that as we go through. I have a small handful of pre-prepared questions that I will be asking each of the panelists, but we definitely want this to be kind of as conversational as possible. So if you have questions you came in with or questions that maybe come up throughout the course of our time together, please put those in the box so we can meld those in with the questions that I've prepared as well. So let me start by just saying a little bit about public policy in general. It's a topic or a concept that I think each of us has some level of familiarity with. I looked at the results of the public policy survey that the AFP Minnesota chapter sent out this past year, and it seemed like about 3/4 of the respondents said they had a good to a really strong familiarity with kind of the concepts of public policy, which is a great starting point. I don't know if today's attendees mirror that or not. But we talk about public policy, we're really lumping a lot of different things together. And as the title indicated, you know, we want to talk a little bit about some of the differences between advocacy and lobbying, which both can fall under that public policy umbrella. And advocacy, in my mind, is something that all of us should be doing. Every nonprofit organization should be doing. We should be advocating for the causes that are important to us as an organization, the causes that are important to our clients that we're serving. And there are no restrictions or limitations in terms of what we can advocate for as nonprofit organizations. And so that should be part of not only a small, you know, group of people's responsibility, but everyone at the organization, both paid staff and volunteer staff. We need to find ways to raise our voice louder. Here in Minnesota and nationally, the nonprofit sector makes up more than 10% of the workforce, yet you wouldn't really know it based on, if you will, our advocacy efforts. Writ large. And sometimes it's because we always try and do this on our own rather than in collaboration. And I think you're going to hear a little bit about some of that collaborative work coming up from our panelists. Now, lobbying, on the other hand, there are some restrictions around lobbying. Nonprofit organizations can lobby. I think that's one of those myths out there that for some reason nonprofits can't lobby, but they actually can. And they have to track what they're lobbying. They have to track expenses against lobbying and how much of our operating budget on an annual basis we're spending toward lobbying. And there are some restrictions, but it's still something that we should be doing. At our organization, for example, at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, 2 of our staff are registered lobbyists. So both Dr. Eric Jolly, our president and CEO, and then Pahua Yang Hoffman, who is our Executive Vice President of Community Impact, are our 2 registered lobbyists. So if we're doing lobbying, they're doing it. But at the same point in time, all of us are involved in advocacy, figuring out how we can advocate for nonprofits, advocate for the philanthropic sector in Minnesota and whatnot. So there's a lot more information on this. If you ever go to the AFP Global website, afpglobal.org, and then look on the public policy tab, there's just a wealth of information, resources there. And then as was shared earlier, the AFP Minnesota public policy page, and that one is in the chat box, the link there. So take some time. If you have questions, reach out to one of these great panelists today. You can reach out to myself with any questions you have afterward about how maybe your organization can take a better route or get more involved there. A couple of other pieces I would say about public policy in general. We're usually looking at public policy through a couple of different lenses. Oftentimes we're looking within the state where we find ourselves here in Minnesota. We certainly do that at the Community Foundation, but some public policy is really governed from a federal perspective as well. I also try and differentiate in our organization the differences between programmatic public policy and philanthropic public policy. So on the programmatic side, that may be where you're most familiar. So those are things like we're advocating for transportation issues, maybe affordable health care. We're advocating for housing and homelessness initiatives. Whatever it is where my organization spends a lot of our time, that's our programmatic public policy. That may be unique to each organization because, again, we all work while we're in the nonprofit sector. It's a diverse sector, as we know, and so we're working with different areas within that sector. But philanthropic public policy is one of those threads that should tie all of us together. And that is, how do we create pro-philanthropy initiatives and legislation that is going to advance our work holistically? And so things like, MCN's efforts to grow the Minnesota state charitable tax deduction. We're one of 2 states in the country that has a state level tax deduction. So if you're taking the larger federal standard deduction now, you can still deduct a portion of your charitable contributions on your state tax deduction. Above $500, limit of 50%. That's how it's written. And that's been in place since now former Governor Pawlenty was in the Senate, I believe. So it's been in place for quite some time here in Minnesota, but MCN and others are trying to advance that, to remove that floor and to expand the threshold. That's philanthropic public policy. That's something we should all be raising our voices around because it would benefit all of our donors, not just those that work in a specific subset of the nonprofit sector. Similarly, on the federal level, AFP Global is very, very involved in creating and now expanding the universal charitable deduction. So AFP Global was very involved in advancing and making permanent the charitable IRA rollover, which happened several years ago. We now have a small universal charitable deduction, which happened earlier this year with the CARES Act, so $300 per person. Above the line deduction, that's a small toe dip in the right pond, but we need to go a lot deeper than that. We need to figure out a way to make philanthropy and charitable giving more equitable, so everyone's receiving benefits, not just those who are in the top or the top income brackets or those who are itemizing on their federal income taxes. But we need to figure out a way to make that more equitable, and we need to figure out things that we can do to help move charitable giving in a meaningful way forward. And so those philanthropic public policy pieces are places that I think we can all advance our work together. And, I call on organizations like AFP, like MCN, MCF here in Minnesota. On the federal level, obviously AFP Global, independent sector, CASE. There's lots of organizations that need to come together to figure out how can we rally around some of these things that do bring us all together, that tie us together, that would benefit all of our organizations, our donors, and those that we serve. And so there's a lot, again, wrapped up there. But when we talk about public policy, there are those nuances: advocacy or lobbying, state versus federal, programmatic versus philanthropic. There's lots to kind of wade through. We'll get through as much as we can between now and 1 o'clock. But I just wanted to set some of that context and stage. For those of you that don't know, AFP also has a political action committee at the federal level. It's the only political action committee, the AFP PAC, that is a single issue PAC dedicated specifically to growing and preserving charitable giving. And so I've had the pleasure of serving on that board for the last 6 years now. And so if folks have questions about ways to get involved there in that philanthropic public policy at a federal level, feel free to reach out to me afterward as well. So let's pivot now over to some of these pre-prepared questions we have for our 3 wonderful panelists. I had the chance to spend some time with each of them earlier this year when we had the ACTCON presentation together, a similar presentation around public policy. We've changed things up a little bit with some of our questions and presentation, but I want to dig into the meat of this. Again, as a reminder, if questions come about based on our discussion, put them in the chat box. I will be monitoring that as we go throughout. So I think the first question I would ask each of our panelists, and I'll call on you just so you know who's responding. Just if you can say a word about how you got involved in public policy work at your organization, whether it was where you're currently at or previously, what was that first, again, toe dip into that pond of public policy for you? And let's start with Rinal.
Everyone, good afternoon. It's nice to be with you. My name is Rinal Ray. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the CEO at People Serving People. And we work with families experiencing homelessness in Hennepin County through providing shelter and supports, and work to move upstream to prevent the experience of family homelessness, both through our programs and our systems change efforts. So I first got started in public policy work by accident. I was a fresh grad out of law school at the start of the last recession, and all of the public interest legal jobs I wanted to do were no longer available. So I kind of fell backward into doing public policy work at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And I was pretty hooked, to be honest. I did go back and do some legal services work, and then realized that what I felt like we were doing so often was finding short-term solutions or band-aids on deep and systemic issues. And that made me want to dig back into policy work. When I was hired at People Serving People 3 years ago as the Director of Systems Change and Community Engagement, we knew that we needed to do something different. Our programs are really wonderful in moments of crisis. We provide great support to our families when they need them. And the best way to provide stability and work towards stability with our families is to make sure they never experience homelessness at all. And part of doing that, or getting to that point, is the need to engage our systems and figure out where we can help shift systems so that families don't end up in this experience. So that was my point of entry around public policy at People Serving People. It was kind of ad hoc. Our former CEO kind of decided what issues to engage in related to our theory of change. And that meant we were working on early ed issues, on housing and homelessness issues, and engaging local and county policymakers as well, in addition to state. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Rinal. Bharti, how did you first get involved in public policy here in this space?
You know, I guess I will echo Rinal's statement that I think I also fell into it by accident. I first started out, interestingly enough, also my first big girl job out of college. Sorry, my name is Bharti Wahi. I work at the Children's Defense Fund of Minnesota. I use she, her pronouns. And if you don't know, Children's Defense Fund is both a policy and advocacy organization, but also a youth development organization, really trying to ensure that all kids and youth have the best start possible, ideally with a caring community around it. And so I too sort of fell into public policy work in the same way. I started working actually in the field of domestic violence, and you know, policies are at work all the time. They're in the air. They're in the way that we can serve or not serve families. It's sort of like the force. It's flowing through everything, right? And so I think that for me, very early on, I began to realize just how much power public policies at the local, state, and federal level have in terms of how folks can live their lives or not, how we were able to serve children and families best. And it felt like I needed to figure that out pretty quick if I wanted to do my job well. And that's sort of how I came to the work. I think that one of the things I very much appreciate, and I have worked on public policy work even at organizations in which that was not our primary task, primarily because it does tend to be so consequential in terms of how you are able to do your work. And what I appreciate about working at the Children's Defense Fund in Minnesota is that I think the way that we approach both our direct service work, our work with community organizations around the state, and then also our systems change work is really aligned for us with the belief that folks have been left behind by systems and by policies that haven't necessarily worked for them. They have often had very little voice in those policies and systems that have such a huge and disproportionate impact on their lives. And so really thinking about how to be able to engage in that work in a way that really amplifies and centers the experience of real folks, and to be the shortest bridge between that and our systems of policy making and power. And I think that what I appreciate about CDF is I think that alignment with the the theory of change that I think informs CDF also is sort of very aligned with mine after 25 years of working in the nonprofit field.
Great, thank you, Bharti. And Jon, your first involvement in the public policy space.
Well, I jokingly say, when I wrote up a few notes, is that I did have a background in student government. And I joke about that, but it does root you in the basics of understanding how government works. You know, and I will give you a clean sweep. I also backed into a government relations role, which was not a strength for me. Previously had worked at Greater Twin Cities United Way in a series of roles, doing campaign fundraising, corporate giving, and a small portfolio of major gifts. But when I came to the Science Museum 6.5 years ago, it was an opportunity to step into a new area, which was government relations and public policy. In the Science Museum, in this role, I have kind of split duties with this. You know, as we are fortunate to receive an appropriation from the state each year, and we do pursue legacy funding. So part of the fundraising part of this for me is that I am responsible for securing and hopefully growing those funds. We know that'll be a challenge in this environment. But the other part with the Science Museum, and in particular the Science Museum, because the educational component and the work that we do is helping to educate and advocate for those, you know, educating legislators. You know, we have 3 position papers around evolution, climate change, and race and equity. And so there's opportunity for our content experts, our curators and scientists to serve as testifiers as policy is being considered at the state, and finding ways to amplify that. And then also our work in education. You know, we have always been known for our exhibits and the thing, you know, as an edutainment venue. But there are a lot of things that the museum does with our outreach programming, education, and particularly with our Kitty Anderson Youth Science Center, which is working with young people in communities that have been traditionally underrepresented in STEM to really provide access and provide you know, that equitable work and access to science and science careers. So it's you know, it takes. We'll get into other pieces around and how we approach that, but you know, there are 2 different parts of that for me, and I'll share a little bit more later.
Great. We have our first question from Rob Hoffman up in Duluth. So thank you, Rob, for posting this. Who do lobbyists lobby? I had to practice that in my head before I said it. And when and where does this activity occur? So Bharti, let's see if you want to answer that question.
So, you know, lobbyists lobby at the unit of government for which you are trying to make change, right? So lobbying can take place with the city council or the mayor's office, but it can also happen at the state and federal level. And you'll see lobbyists really interacting with legislators primarily, really. And usually lobbying is very specific. It is around a specific bill, a very specific sort of policy or piece of legislation. And I would say the distinction here is advocacy is like, Jon talked about like why education in STEM in communities of color is really important in terms of bringing up the next generation of thought leaders in that space. That's advocacy and really speaking to the issue. Lobbying is really about a specific piece of legislation. So for example, on the federal level, there's a lot of very specific legislation that's happening around the stimulus that may impact many of the people that you are supporting through your own efforts as well. And there's some very specific legislation on that. And lobbyists are working and interacting with policymakers to really ensure that the critical elements of that, the knowledge base that is coming from policy wonks and developers and community are incorporated in those pieces of legislation. And they usually can do it in the Capitol. Now in this virtual world, it is a bit of a new day. We're all trying to figure out what lobbying looks like when you are not in person. But I think it is oftentimes those very specific interactions on very specific bills that are tied to some of the work that we're doing. But I would invite Rinal and Jon to add to my potentially inadequate answer.
No, great response. Anything, John, Rinal?
Nothing to add. That was
Okay.
awesome.
So Rinal, let me move to you for the next question that I have, and that is, who is involved in this kind of work at your organization, and how do you involve volunteers in public policy work as well?
Yeah, sure. We're trying to get to a place in our organizational culture where everybody is involved in public policy work and advocacy work and in lobbying, sometimes in lobbying, right? I'm a registered lobbyist for People Serving People. But we know that at different points of our process around developing our legislative priorities, around mobilizing staff and community and volunteers to advance those priorities, folks need to be involved. So our frontline staff is really excellent in helping us identify like small issues or breakdowns in process and in systems. Our development team is so expert in helping us tell stories and figure out who's got relationships with the decision makers that we need to be reaching. Our volunteers also have tremendous experience in relationships, right? Like they can get us into places where we may not have the relationships to get into. So we've been engaging our volunteers through trainings, through storytelling, through the ways that we're sharing narrative, through our relationship building, through making sure that they have opportunities to connect directly with our families, to hear our family stories. And really mostly who we're trying to engage in this work is our families. They are closest to the issues at hand and they are the keys to the solutions. And so the ways that we do that is by listening and listening deeply and taking the cue from them on what we prioritize and how we move through the work. We do a Homeless Day on the Hill every year where we invite our whole universe of folks to join us to advocate at the state legislature. I bet that'll look really different this year or next year, I suppose, but we'll continue to do that. We invite folks to join us for conversations. We have decision makers and electeds come to our building and we'll host used to host a lobby social, which was a little bit more of an informal meet and greet, so our families could connect directly with their electeds. And we find ways to integrate into our programs to make it a little bit seamless. So it's not like a separate thing, it's just a part of how we do the work.
Great, thank you, Rinal. John, Bharti, any examples of how you involve volunteers, or to Kelsey's question in the chat, how do you maybe also involve donors in this kind of work, either around lobbying or advocacy?
I'm willing to take a shot at that.
Sure.
So, thinking of your primary volunteers are your board of directors, your most vested, and that is where we have leveraged some opportunity there. Like Rinal, I'm also a registered lobbyist. We have our president is also. A lot of that is tied to the work that we do around our appropriation and the direct lobbying that we are doing to secure that. We have, you may be familiar, we had a $26 million building project that we did lobby the state for state bonding. And with that, we utilized many different volunteers, particularly just adding to Bharti's comment earlier, when you talk about who do you lobby, you really focus on the committee members who are responsible for wherever your issue is residing. And then because once you have them on your side, then the rest of the legislature, if you're going to the state, tends to follow with that. So we have done that. I also say, that is the lobbying aspect, which is different than the advocacy. And advocacy, you can, that is for everyone. And one of the things that I like to say, government, it doesn't matter where you enter the stream, because a democracy is for the people, by the people. I might have inverted that, but you get what I mean. And so there's always an opportunity to learn, and advocacy, getting your members, getting your visitors, getting your clients, getting people aware, and having them raise their voice, reach out to stakeholders, the legislators, and share their opinions. It does matter. It all makes a difference. You will find that the elected officials or their offices will respond to you. All of that is being tabulated.
Great. So the next question, Bharti, I'm going to start with you, but I'm hoping I'll open it up for all the panelists as well. So each of you might have some familiarity with AFP and the fact that a few years ago, AFP really started taking a more intentional effort, both at the state level and at the global level, around equity. And they formed what they called the IDEA Committee, or IDEA Initiative, standing for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access. And so the question is, how have you been able to weave issues around IDEA, so inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, into your public policy agenda, either at your organization or maybe at other organizations that you're familiar with? So why don't we start with Bharti on that?
Well, I'll start with CDF first. I will say I'm very lucky in the sense that I think that the issue of equity, of race equity, particularly of inclusion, of cultural relevance as you serve children and families, has always been, I think, a central component of the theory of change that Ms. Marian Wright Edelman held as she started CDF Minnesota, right? And the national organization as well. So for us, it has not necessarily been something we've had to weave on or into, but was actually part of the roots of our organizational sort of germination. And not that we don't continuously have to re-examine that, because bias lives in us all, and how we are thinking about that, right? But I do think that is actually one of the reasons I'm at CDF, to be honest with you, because that lived there from its inception. But I do think that oftentimes people who are in positions of power don't have a lot of experience with poverty, with economic insecurity, and what that really means to not really have enough food for the week, right? They oftentimes don't really have experience because our systems tend to still be pretty like white dominant culture, pretty male too. So they don't really have a lot of experience with what it's really like to sort of experience systemic racism, to how implicit bias might be playing out in certain areas. So I think for us, part of our work is both, how are we developing public policies that are informed by folks that actually do understand that reality? And then again, how can we play a really important bridge to create greater proximity between those who are making decisions and that lived experience? And it's a tough needle to thread, to do it authentically, to do it in a way that I think really centers the lived experience of folks, meets folks where they're at if they haven't had these experiences or these understandings. And so I think for us, that has been, it's a constant conversation in our organization. It is a constant area of examination and evaluation in terms of how we are doing our own work. And so, I think that is I think one of the pieces that we hold, and the tension that we hold, at least in the context of how we are doing the work at CDF. I think for other organizations that I've been at, I think it has really been also like, you have to understand what you mean as an organization when you talk about equity. You need to understand what it means when you think about concepts like structural racism or geographic inequity, right? If you're statewide, like, what does it really mean? And you have to have an understanding of that. And I think the organizations that I've done this I think has really took a long, hard look about what they meant. And then when they started to externalize that, when they started to work with policymakers, they were speaking from a place of not perfect comfort, because I think these are challenging issues, but I think you got to know what you mean before you start telling other people what that is, right? And I think the organizations that I think have been most successful have really taken the time to do that examination.
Great comment.
But again, I defer to Jon and Rinal.
So let me ask Rinal, other ideas or examples that you would add from your experience, either with organizations you've been a part of or other organizations that are really kind of a beacon of success out there in terms of incorporating IDEA concepts into their public policy work.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Bharti has shared. I think what I was hearing from what Bharti was sharing, and what I share in classes that I've taught on nonprofit legislative advocacy, and in our own work here, we've been on this journey, is that public policy carries a historical a cultural, and a power-based context. And all of that, US and Minnesota public policy decision-making and implementation is rooted in and centers whiteness. So I think that at a foundation is really important to acknowledge and to understand that the decisions that have been made in the past and that are still being made today, it's not a surprise that we're in the situation that we're in, where Minnesota leads the country around just about every disparity indicator, right? Like, not a surprise. And it's important to know if we're going to be effective in our advocacy and lobbying strategies, and to know how to do that effectively. So at People Serving People, like, we've been on this journey for a little while. We still got a whole lot of work to do around kind of deeply understanding what racial equity means in our context, what it means for us internally, what it means for how we present externally. But what we do know and what we have been doing is making sure we're applying a really explicit racial equity lens to determining our legislative priorities. We work in housing and homelessness. There's 50 million issues we could be working on, and we don't have that kind of capacity. So we have to be targeted and specific around where we're going to step in and put our stamp of support, and then actually put our feet on the ground to advance. And we want to be thoughtful about how we do that, and laying things out in filtering our decisions by using a racial equity lens is really important. And there's amazing tools to help organizations do that in the nonprofit context. Like Voices for Racial Justice locally has a great impact assessment. Nationally, PolicyLink and Race Forward have really great resources as well. And the other thing that we're doing, and we're learning how to do this better because it's hard, is learning how to center the issues and the ideas that are being prioritized by our families. And what that means is that I thought we would be working on state issues. We're actually working on county level issues because that's where our families need us to be working. And I've got to roll with that as the organizational leaders if I say that this is what our priority is.
Great. Jon, I'm going to pivot over to you to start the next question, and it comes from one of our attendees as well, Bridget Hansen. So can you share any examples of how you or others may have used public relations or marketing campaigns to help advance a public policy initiative? So I'm wondering if each of the panelists might be able to think of one specific example. Just, I think we probably have time for one example each of where you've seen something like that work well. And if you want a second to think about it, I'll give one example while you're thinking. One of the ways that AFP Global has been involved is a few years ago, maybe a couple of years ago, I lose track of time, especially during COVID. There was a piece of legislation introduced in California that was around substantiation for charitable gifts. And what it was going to require was that any contribution of $250 or more, nonprofits would have to capture and hold securely the social security number of the individual making the charitable gift. And there was a lot of concern around that. A security issue, from a donor relations issue. How do we figure out how to do this, especially some of our smaller nonprofits that are still keeping things, let's say, in Excel documents or in cloud-based software that might not be as secure. And it was all around substantiation. AFP California, one of the chapters, raised that up in the Sacramento area. They advanced on AFP Global very quickly in the span of a couple of days. It was something like 60,000 letters, emails, phone calls went out from AFP members all around that area into, well, not AFP members, but AFP was coordinating it. And all of a sudden that piece of legislation got pulled. So it never even got advanced. And so I think that's a place where there was something that was going to happen. We rallied around it. We got going really quickly. We organized something almost overnight and sent it out to the AFP membership, and they helped advance and circulate it throughout California. Now, that's something on a statewide basis, but that same sort of thing could be done on a federal level as well, should the need arise. So, Jon, do you have any examples of where you've seen that work well?
Yeah, yes. And it's part of a broader campaign that the museum has been committed to and will be raising significantly more profile to. We had planned to do that, but the pandemic took us in a different direction. And that's really around the importance of climate change. And what we have heard from our members and visitors is that they want to hear from us. They want to hear from the museum around our position on that, because there has been so much back and forth around the veracity of the science, and the science speaks very clearly. And so just one thing that we have done, and this speaks to the ways that you can amplify your policy, you don't have to do it just on your own, is we took an active part in the climate strike last year and had plans to do so again this year. Organizing a march, going to the Capitol, being a place, a starting point for that. Had a lot of great social coverage, and just being a part of that. If I can, I just want to very quickly go back to the last question, because I do not have a lot to add, particularly following someone, Rinal, who taught a class on it. But for our organization and for cultural organizations, it is simply recognizing the place where you are. And cultural organizations have been the beneficiaries of white privilege, and working very, very specifically to understand that. And Bharti, you spoke to this as well. You don't know what you don't know, and using this as an organization, to starting from our hiring practices to our board recruitment to understanding our own selves, and saying to myself, I have white privilege, and I need to be a better equity champion. And so I wanted to add that to the conversation, because that's what we can all do.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. Either Rinal or Bharti, do either of you have an example you want to share about where you've seen, again, kind of public relations marketing campaigns used to advance either a public policy agenda or some type of advocacy effort?
I'll mention one, and this is actually from our national office. We've had the good privilege of working with Fallon Worldwide, who is located here in the Twin Cities, and also does a fair amount of advertising, kind of nationally and internationally. The whole Arby's, where's the meter, whatever thing, is all of them. And kind of in the early 90s, they did a campaign around budget cuts to children. And they created this image, and it is provocative for sure, but it was an image of a baby with a diaper and like a bullseye, and it was like, be careful where you cut. And I think that campaign, and I say this because you all are fundraising professionals, like, I think that there are ways that the CDF was able to really push on a public policy agenda, like to speak to that agenda and like the dangers of that from a policy perspective. But it was also, to be honest with you, a very effective fundraising campaign for CDF too. And one of the things that I want to highlight is there's also an opportunity, like oftentimes as an organization at CDF, I am both asking people to take action of some sort. Please call your legislator, please, support these issues. And I'm also kind of asking for their donation. So I think that there are there's work that you're already doing with your donors and how you're speaking with them and how you think about campaigns that could maybe even just be slightly extended or expanded to include, as you develop your own policy strategies and agenda, that component. Because I've seen that work for CDF. And, you don't have to go it doesn't have to be huge, but there might be some ways to sort of pilot some things that might be a twofer, if you will, right? That has both a fundraising component of that campaign and a PR element, and then also a policy one.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try and ask one more question to see if one or maybe two of you want to answer this. It comes from Jen, and it's actually similar to a question that I have as well. So I'm going to try and weave the two together. In essence, how do smaller organizations, some of us work at very small nonprofits, how do smaller organizations typically get involved in public policy work, and how might they use things like partnerships, collaboratives, volunteers in different ways to play a role when they don't have dedicated staff like many of us do that we just talked about here? So does anyone feel comfortable? I know, Bharti, you're probably at the smallest of the three organizations right now, but anyone want to try and answer that one?
I can give it a go here. So none of us, even big organizations, goes it alone with public policy work. It takes a village to raise those kids, and it takes a village to be able to pass policy, right? And so there are some, I think, really great and strong coalitions that I think small nonprofits can, I think it's a good way to dip your toe into that kind of work, right? To sort of understand I think many of you already know sort of what are the policy constraints or opportunities your organization or the folks that you serve are contending with, right? But starting there and gaining that strong understanding as an organization, and then looking around, there are coalitions that are working on the issue of homelessness, on climate change, on child poverty, and that's just a few things, right? On asset building and wealth development and educational equity, and I could go on. So I do think that there are ways for smaller and mid-sized nonprofits to really think about like looking around. You don't have to be a lobbyist to understand what are the issues that are happening in Minnesota or in your county. What you have a unique contribution, even if you're not lobbying, to this work, right? And all of our public policy work is about aligned contribution. None of us can attribute anything to any one of our organizations. It is us working in partnership and coalition with others that really gets that work done. And I would invite you to identify what you believe might be your own unique contribution to the conversation, even if it's just listening or offering the perspective of practitioners into the policy realm, and to see. But there are a whole host of coalitions. And I'm happy to put my email in the chat. And if you're like, is there a coalition that's working on food security? Yeah, there is. And I can connect you. So happy to make some of those connections. But I would say that's one way to be able to do that.
Great. Rinal, were you going to say something? I know we're down to probably our last 60 seconds here.
Yeah, I'll chime in really quick. I think it's important to just start where you are. Pick something that's easy and that's manageable and doable and start there. It could be just figuring out who your electeds are for your organization, inviting them to a Zoom coffee, or inviting them to your gala, or finding some other way to build relationship with them. I think that's such an easy place to start. Attend a day on the Hill, probably virtually next year. Just find those easy engagement opportunities so you can start learning and building more relationships and capacity.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone, thank our panelists. Big word of thanks to Bridget. I know Mike, I see you on the Zoom here as well. Tim, everyone from Hanson, Henley, Yoder, and Lamb for their generous support of AFP Minnesota. And with that, I will turn it back to President Dan to close things out.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you so much, everyone, for this amazing conversation today. This has been really interesting and inspiring. If you're interested in continuing this wonderful conversation around inspiring donors and engaging politically, join us just next week on December 8th, where we're going to have another education session that will delve more deeply into this topic of engaging both donors and political activity. I am going to put a link to that right now, and you can find that on the AFP Minnesota website also. Thank you, everyone.